Tere and good morning, everybody. I think there may have been some confusion the last time about the way of organizing the presentations on your side. The idea was to have one or two people of you choose a topic and choose the relevant literature for this topic, which is in the approximately 2 papers. That I uploaded to Moodle, wasn't it? To Moodle. So if one topic is chosen, nobody else can choose it, of course. And then if this happened, we should agree on dates when everybody wants to present orally, by talking. So my question is, who has already looked at the Moodle site of the seminar? Okay, and have you decided first on a topic? Yes? Which one is yours, may I ask?
Conflict, and we have 3 people already in this group.
Okay, I would like to reduce the number of people to 2 per topic, because we are not so many anymore as we were at the beginning. But as you chose already, just stay you 3, okay? What other topics are there? History.
Myths and monsters.
Beg your pardon?
Myths and monsters.
Myths and monsters. That's good. Because I would like to start with this in 2 weeks' time. It has to do with genetic engineering and everyday ideas about this technology. Anybody else has chosen a topic?
Global warming.
Global warming, okay.
Or foreseeing.
Okay.
Natural versus unnatural.
Okay, this goes together with actually genetic engineering and biotechnology next time. Is this possible? I mean, in terms of organization. I will go back and look at the list of topics once more. Yeah, okay, we have topic 1, 2, 3, it's numbered anyway. In this sequence of numbers, I would like to go ahead. So have biotechnology in 2 weeks, and synthetic biology, if there is anybody taking this. Has anybody interest in synthetic, which is actually just a continuation of the biotechnology and genetic engineering thing? Nobody? Okay. So actually we can forget about this. The biology and medicine, there were some people interested on the list. You? Okay, which one did you? Infectious diseases. Anybody else with conception? Okay, that's in 4 weeks then. Okay. Do you have a companion or are you alone? I think it's fine to be alone, no problem. Okay, and you? So maybe you want to subscribe.
Yes.
And before it's gone. I mean, if somebody subscribes, hey, it will be unavailable for others, the topic.
Yeah, it's subscribed now. Yeah.
Okay.
And you must do it in Moodle. Right.
Shall we maybe right here? What is the date of the next time? Does anybody? It's the 8th. Okay, then we have the next is 22nd. Three was biology and medicine. And 4. Okay? That's climate change. And again, 2 weeks later, that's the 5th of November, 5 and 6. That's history and G-risks. Okay? It may well be that I interfere and present parts of it myself just to help you or to complement your presentation, okay? I feel free to do this. And so maybe it could be that one or the other of the presentations can be moved to the next date, okay? This can happen. Okay? There is an upload where the file says for everybody or something to that effect. This is the basic literature for everybody to look at, please. It's very short. It's not long. It's 2 papers that give you an overview of what we are doing here. Okay? Good. Any more questions?
So I was as well in the group where we had already 3 people, so we will do it all together. Or,
Which group was this?
conflict construction.
Okay, good. Okay, it's fine. So if you have 3 people, I mean, everybody, in my opinion, everybody should have the chance to present a part of this. Is this possible? But this presentation should not be divided in the sense of one paper is presented by this person, the other paper, if there are 2, is presented by the other person. What I really urge you to do is to integrate the 2 papers because they are tackling a similar problem. So you should try to extract the shared content and how these 2 contents integrate into a presentation. Okay? Please. Not one paper after the other. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay? Any more questions to that? There are none. So let's go ahead. Last time we talked about general ideas about social representation theory and how this has an effect on our way of thinking about societal or social problems. Today I want to choose a particular topic, let's say, something that we had a project about, a European project for 15 years actually, having continuous work on this topic. But what I'm presenting has nothing very concretely to do with the presentations that I distributed. Okay? So what we want to discuss today is the technology of biotechnology and how this can be and has been analyzed in a European-wide project, and this will illustrate you some aspects of social representation theory in the sense of being an approach to large-scale or small-scale societal problems. So what is genetic engineering? Genetic engineering, everybody knows, is the direct manipulation of an organism's genome and the technology to change the genetic information that is being encoded in the chromosomes or in the DNA. Does anybody know what DNA stands for? It's a chemical abbreviation of what? Good. Desoxyribonucleic acid. Right. Bravo. And this acid, this complex chemical stuff, is encoding our genetic makeup and what we look like. Our phenotype is determined mostly by the genotype that is being encoded in the DNA. So the DNA, manipulating the DNA, actually is a very deep-seated, let's say, intrusion into life and into the language of life. So it's no wonder that many people in Europe and the world over have a problem with that. And we are analyzing how these people cope with the problem. But let's first set the scene. First, we have the scientific industrial complex. The scientists, since the 1970s, were trying to get into the genome and to change the genetic information that is being encoded there. This, after some time, went together with the industry, who, as we all know, has a big interest to manipulate plants in order to be resistant to herbicides, for example, or to manipulate plants in order to make them resistant to some pests. But this is not met by the general public, is not welcomed by the general public because of certain resistance to this idea. Interest groups are all the groups that could eventually be affected by genetic engineering. These are then non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace, like Global 2000, etc., who, and of course the governments, who have an interest in order to control or contain the potential risks that may be involved in the technology. And around this core processes that are mostly political and economic, we have three players. That is the public that maintains and forms a certain way of perceiving this new technology. We have the media coverage that goes hand in hand with the public's perception. And we have the policy perception, or the policy regulation, trying to come to terms with the new technology in order to avoid dangers to the populations in Europe. So very briefly, the structure of our project, which was relatively big. Let's just look at the yellow squares. We were interested, on one hand, in the general public, in the media discourse, and in the policy process. In order to cover the general public's perception, we had a module that was involved in designing Eurobarometer questionnaires, that were questionnaires being passed across all of Europe. So it was a quantitative approach, a questionnaire approach. In the qualitative module, in all participating countries, we had focus groups and interviews about this topic. And the media, we were interested in the longitudinal studies, in the longitudinal development of reporting about this technology, and also about the details within each historical slice, so to say, in a kind of cross-sectional analysis. And another group, more specialized on policy of the project, was looking at the policy regulations having been implemented in different countries in Europe. So let's start with the beginning of a project. The first results that we got using items that were directed to measure riskiness, the perceived riskiness of this technology, the perceived usefulness of this technology, the perceived moral acceptability, and the how much it should be supported. The answers to these 4 items gave us head scratching. We really had to scratch our heads because the following was the result. That was in the first Eurobarometers. If you wanted to predict how much GM crop and food should be encouraged, and we used the usefulness, the riskiness, and the morality as predictors in a regression analysis, we got extremely strong prediction by the moral acceptability. But what is a moral acceptability in a technology? Please, what is a moral acceptability? We had no idea of how to cope with that. The funny thing was that in a comparison of, for example, nuclear technology, which is also known for its riskiness and for its debates, we saw that nuclear technology has a completely different pattern of being judged by the people. Nuclear technology is primarily judged by its riskiness, whereas biotechnology or gene technology, genetic engineering, is judged to be immoral, much more than being risky. But what is immorality with the technology? Does it have to do with hubris, with thinking that the people or technology or scientists should not approach life, particularly human life, in a way that looks like playing God, playing God in determining the genetic outfit of people and of animals and of plants. So even though the 2 technologies have certain risks involved, gene and genetic engineering was the one with the biggest concerns in the public about its morality. And this gave us the hunch that we should look at the social representation that is being behind these judgments. How do the people perceive and construct their impression? So first, after a series of years where we had collected data, etc., we developed what we called a collective symbolic coping theory. That is basically like aimed at how in a societal process the unfamiliar is being made, is rendered cognizable or talkable. How is it made accessible to my thinking in everyday life in a symbolic way? It is at the end about imagining the unfamiliar and constructing a picture of that. And for doing this, we postulated 4 process elements in collective symbolic coping. The first process element was that we need a public attention in order for the people starting talking about something. And this is usually done in modern societies by media. The media set an agenda, and this agenda is being elaborated in the daily reporting. And this may go over years. In the course of this media discourse, together with maybe personal interests of the people involved, we have a divergent production of images and metaphors. That is the images that we use to imagine this strange technology or this difficult to understand technology, was to find pictures or images or even metaphors that allow us to capture the essence of this technique. So first, in the media we saw, or we will see something like a divergent production of images that will, after some time, converge onto a dominant metaphor or image that is understood by everybody or by most people, and that can be used as the icon of a new technology that captures more or less what we want to capture. And then when the media hype is over, we have a phase of post-collective symbolic coping, where what the media people call normalizing may happen. That is, the topic is being constructed as something that is not risky anymore, that is not hype anymore, that is just there. We did this interview by, as I said already, in the project overview, by running qualitative interviews, focus groups, and quantitative questionnaires, as well as longitudinal newspaper studies, starting from the 70s, when the technology came up in Asilomar in California, in the laboratory of Asilomar, that is a chemical laboratory or university laboratory. Okay? So what is public attention? Public attention, of course, arises when there is something potentially dangerous, something that may influence our lives. So the relevance, the societal relevance of some novel technology is being assessed by NGOs, by other scientists, etc., and also eventually by politics. But in the way of doing this, the media pick the topic up because they're always interested in debate and in having a, how shall I say, a strong eye-catcher for the readership. This agenda setting is, of course, relative to the different sectors that exist in a society. In the society, we know we have different sectors. There is the more entrepreneurial sector. There is the normal consumer sector. There is the academically educated sector. There is the less academically educated sector, etc., etc. All these different sectors can be assumed to have their own discussions and debates about a new technology. And this is particularly relevant when a technology threatens to enter one's life world, to be available on the shelves of a supermarket. If that is the case, then I should know what is in this product that I'm going to buy. For example, in this can of tomatoes that is waiting in the shelves of the supermarket for me to buy it. So let's look at media attention. For illustrating the topic, we have three countries or country groups. One is Austria, where we did the first analysis. Greece is the second one, where a similar process as in Austria can be observed. And the other one is the sum of the responses in the Eurobarometer from Sweden, Holland, and Denmark. Between the years 73, as I said, where the technology was invented in California, and 1999, when the study was, when the second fielding of the Eurobarometer was carried out. So we have, and this doesn't work. Interesting. Hey. Yeah, anyway, I can make a drawing here. Yeah, Microsoft sometimes lets you, doesn't want to produce products that are flawless. So I'm just wondering if a restart maybe helps. I will try a restart, okay? Because it's much nicer to see there. Or I show it here. Yeah, okay, that's even better. What you see here are three colors. Austria is the violet one, green is Greece, and blue is Denmark, Holland, Sweden. Denmark, Holland, Sweden, we knew, are countries where there is a strong science friendliness in the general public. Whereas in Austria, we know also historically, Austrians are very skeptical about technologies and science. And the Greeks the same way. So what we see here with Austria, for example, is that in 1996, there is an increased attention of the media for this technology, and we have an increased reporting, quantity of reporting on this technology. That is a steep rise in media interest. This steep rise was triggered by a release experiment by a biotechnology firm that produced potatoes for industrial usage that had a lot of starch in it, more starch than normal potatoes. You know, starch is an industrial product that is used in many other products. And this genetically modified potato, Symflora, it was called, met the resistance of the environmental interest groups because it threatened to infect, so to say, other potato growing plants and make them unnatural in a way. So we have a sudden attention. The same in Greece a year later or 2 years later, where we have a sudden rise in public attention because some NGO discovered in Greece that the so-called safer flavor tomato, which is a genetically engineered American product, a tomato that supposedly does not rot very quickly, was found in the shelves of a supermarket. And then we see in the other countries that are more positive oriented towards science, a rather steady increase of reporting. So whereas in the Denmark, Holland, Sweden, and other countries that were positively inclined towards scientific achievements, we see a gradual increase of reporting. In these two countries, Austria and Greece, we see a low reporting over the years and only at the end a steep rise. And this is exactly what happens when a new topic comes up into the public and is taken on the agenda of the media. Okay. The knowledge items that we used a series of items that were coming out of first of other surveys where the scientific knowledge of people was being assessed in Eurobarometers, as well as, and these are the red items, as well as items that came up from interviews with people about biotechnology. And in these interviews, I found that people talked about biotechnology and genetic engineering as if genetic engineering was introducing something completely strange into natural plants, tomatoes in this case. That's why we included this item. Ordinary tomatoes do not contain genes, while genetically modified tomatoes do. From this comes the media headline, "No genes in Austria," which is a political stupidity. I mean, given the importance of genes, that's all. Okay, we had a series of 10 items that were 6 out of that were, so to say, textbook knowledge, and the red ones are those that assessed something like the social representation of the people about technology. The answers they had to give was true or not true, or don't know. Then we had a series of attention items. People had to say if they had heard about, if they had been talking about, etc., etc. And what we see here is that in Austria, in the year 1996, we have a strange relationship between textbook knowledge and having read and heard about it, that is the level of awareness. Austria at that time was very low in average level of textbook knowledge, whereas all other countries, well, we have other low knowledge countries like Spain, Portugal, and Greece. We have high knowledge countries like Denmark, Sweden, Holland. And the relationship between the two variables was like this, relatively strong. No, it's a strong correlation. Only Austria jumps out because exactly in this country, in this year, when the data were assessed, the media took up the agenda of biotechnology. So the public attention was there. They have heard about it very frequently, but they started off with a low level of biological background knowledge. So this sets the agenda for a coping process. People are symbolically actually pressed or urged to take a position. To take a position also in political decisions, because, funny enough, the government set up a people's referendum, a referendum in the following years where they wanted to know from the public if genetic engineering should be forbidden in Austria in agriculture. So the people had to make up their minds. They had heard about it, had little knowledge, and were in the position of having the need to construct divergent images. So the new thing needs to be interpreted and to be accommodated in a metaphor or an image. And the motivation may be different from different people. It may be curiosity. I'm curious to know what is this new technology. It may be motivated by the need to know something about this in order to master the new technology, in order to know what's going to be on my plate, my cooking plate, when I eat something that is genetically modified. There is also the need to join the community in conversations and to understand the television news, for example. All this together may motivate the achievement or the need to construct images, to construct ideas, to construct for oneself a metaphorical idea. And all this is, of course, taken up by the media and used on and off in media reporting. So, was jumping back, why that? Okay. These media images that popped up were, for example, mostly tomatoes, but not only. This one that very well tries to capture the inherent dangers in biotechnology or the chemical processes that nobody seems to understand, or cloning in the political sphere, etc., etc. And this one is a nice one because it illustrates, it's used by the most stupid newspaper in Austria, but still the picture is good because it shows three things. First, the people protect each other. Even the dogs are being protected by this protection cloth. And then they are about to eat a big tomato, which looks, and of course is, a a monster. It's a monster tomato. And this monstrosity is a topic that comes up in the myth and presentations that we will hear next time. So we have the strangeness and the risk and the monstrosity all together in one picture. That is being captured by this a cartoon. This happened 1996 in Austria, and similarly a little bit later in Greece in the media. And there was a change between the year 1996 and 1999, because these are the 3-year distance is the period where we could field Eurobarometers on this topic. So every 3 years for 15 years we had measures of the European public. But what we see here is that in the year 96, okay, I should explain the method. This is a correspondence analysis result, analyzing the responses of the people to the red items that you remember, the red items that reflected the representational way of thinking, the images or metaphors that the people may use, like something, genes or something foreign to natural living beings, etc., etc. So we had 3 answers, I told you. That is to say, yes, this is true, to say, no, this is not true, that genes are something foreign, or to say, no, I don't know. So what we see here, 1996, with the biggest media attention, Austrians were very close to finding the metaphorical image plausible, to accept the image. And 3 years later, they moved away from here. They moved away more towards the center, more towards a general opinion that is being shared in more countries of Europe. Whereas in Greece, we see from 96 to 99 the opposite movement. They were in the process of constructing the representation, of constructing the image of the genes being foreign, whereas Austrians already had this in 96 due to the media attention. And they moved, 3 years later, they moved a little bit way of this finding a plausibility judgment of finding this, how shall I say, fantastic general social representation about genetic engineering, finding this plausible. So at this time, it comes to a convergence where the multitude of images is being condensed into 1, 2, or 3 that are being used by many media. So we have an elimination and conventionalization, the process that Bartlett described in his study on the War of the Ghosts. That is an early study on how contents become conventionalized, how the contents change when we read something from a story from a different culture. When it is being transferred between generations of telling, for example, that the conventionalization more and more takes the effect that the story becomes more and more adapted to our local culture. Finally, we have a metaphor that contains several parts. And what is important is to know that a social representation is not scientifically veridical. It is, of course, has nothing to do with the technological processes or the scientific insights that are important in genetic engineering. But still, it's an important way of thinking about this technology because it allows me to converse, to have a communication about it, to understand communication and to participate in debates. So social representations, even though they do not reflect scientifically correct knowledge, have a knowledge function. And this is reflected in the fact that the don't know answers of Austrians and Greeks before the media hype were very high. So the people felt the freedom to say, I have no idea about genetic engineering. I'm not interested. That's something strange to me, that's far away. I have nothing to do with it. Whereas in the moment where media hype sets in and public discourse starts, the people are actually in a position of having to take a position, of having to understand what's being reported, what people talk about. And this sudden change in the sudden presence of something that was not there before, or that was not interesting before, becomes interesting because everybody talks about it. So I'm forced to develop an image and to subscribe to the social representation that is converging in a society. So we have a knowledge function of social representations because it helps me to communicate, it helps me to understand, it helps me to act in everyday life. And of course it has a semantic space of understanding that we will look at later. So this convergent image looked more or less like this. We have healthy looking tomatoes that are being taken by a scientist or some assistant to the scientist with gloves. So it may be dangerous, huh? If you touch potatoes with gloves, so not like in the supermarkets to protect others from your germs, but in order to protect yourself from the terrible tomatoes, and something is being injected into them, which is obviously the genes that are being injected into it, which captures extremely well a person's response in an interview that we did at our department a year before designing the questionnaire. And this is what the person said. She thought that, well, we are all living well, we are not hungry, and I don't understand why we still need even bigger, monstrous tomatoes. It's certainly healthier producing the things in a natural way instead of mixing something to it or to inject something. This was one of the more typical responses in an interview that is very well reflected in this image, this media image, a year later. Okay, what we see here is a very typical thing. From ignorance, from self-admitted ignorance on an issue that has no relevance for me, I say, I'm not interested in that, forget it. So I don't know. And suddenly it becomes important. You have to form an opinion. You must develop or subscribe to the social representation that is coming up in the societal discourse and the media representations. That helps us to participate in this hype. Okay, the hype passes by, and then we have the post CSC, or collective symbolic coping, time where cultivation or other processes set in that we know from media research. Some of you, I think, are communication and media people, aren't they? Students of, who is this? Can you raise your hand? Oh, not very many. Okay, but nevertheless. So you know the different terms that are being used in media science. Just to illustrate and take together the different the different processes is, let's look at this. First, as I said, the intensity of media goes up, and this is the beginning of a collective coping process. This has the consequence that the high level of ignorance at the beginning falls sharply, and the people are forced to attain some knowledge in the form of a social representation about this. This leads to an increase of the imaginary representation of the images that are being found plausible about genetic engineering. And only slowly, real scientific knowledge is being attained in the general public, only in the long time. So just to summarize, self-ascribed knowledge is the usual response when something is not interesting for me, if it doesn't touch me. Then the media come up with an issue, and suddenly self-ascribed ignorance would put you in a disadvantaged position, because you would admit to your friends who are all maybe discussing this issue that I have no idea what this is, and you're in the danger of being rejected as a conversation partner. Then we have the discursive elaboration of the social representation, first by divergent image productions in the media, then by a convergent process that also goes hand in hand with the political responses, with the NGOs pushing politicians to create laws about the new technology, etc. And the end result of such a collective symbolic coping process is a social representation that integrates not a true representation of the scientific background of a technology, but a tasteful, something that is good to think about, that's good to imagine. And for the everyday people, it's good to imagine that genes are something that technologists or scientists inject into natural tomatoes. So it's something foreign to natural living beings. Because many people lack the basic knowledge or the basic background knowledge of how the biological and the hereditary mechanism works in reality. Taken together, we can see that we should see that a person usually attains its knowledge, irrespective of being representational, discursive, or communicative knowledge, or even school knowledge across others. So we have basically, in the deep sense, an epistemological trajectory of everyday life that always goes across others, across institutions, across other people and their discourses, where I'm just a very small participant in it. And this defines my relationship to an object or to some novel scientific technology. Do you have any questions to that? Or comments? No? So let's say, yeah.
I have a question about the possibility of different levels of this representation. For instance, in the example of a school lesson, when, for instance, a physics teacher is trying to simplify some kind of a process for children.
Yeah.
That kind of follows the same logic. Is there any difference?
This also employs metaphorical and imaginary knowledge, of course, or imaginary means of transporting this scientific theory. And in fact, school is responsible for many of our everyday representations that we maintain and that have nothing to do with science at all. We'll come back to this actually in the presentations about conception. the German ovum, sperm and ovum thing, and also with regard to physics. I don't know if I have it here. As my lecture at 4 o'clock is very similar in content to the seminar where we discuss social representation theory particularly, I am not quite sure where I'm going to present this, but we are coming up with a physics example as an example for popularizing, and using images and metaphors to present some scientific insights. Okay? But it's true. I mean, even there was a study about the use of metaphors by scientific workers, by researchers, by scientists. And what they found was that at the beginning of starting to think about a problem, about a target problem that the researcher was going to tackle, he or she uses a lot of metaphorical thinking. And it makes sense. If you remember for those who have been in the lecture, where I've been talking about our heritage from human development over the evolution of humans, one of the characteristics of our way of thinking is to have first different modules that are responsible for different fields of being applied. For example, mechanical processes that we understand with one module, social relationships we understand with a different mental module, I should say, which in human development came more and more together in the way of overlapping each other, and the way of being accessible from other modules, having created relationships or pathways between the different modules that allowed the metaphorical use of one module for understanding something in a different module. For example, if I have a mechanics module, this knowledge may help me at the beginning metaphorically to understand some social process, which is represented in the social module. And in the same sense, as we try to understand things in our everyday life, scientists also start off with this first attempt to understand something in metaphorical terms. But what was found out is that during the way of research, during the years of doing research more and more analytically, more and more deeper on some issue, the scientists shed away and forget about the metaphors and replace them by mostly quantitative knowledge about the relationship between several factors and variables in their object of study. Okay? So they shed the metaphorical frame and replace it by their, as we want to say, real scientific representation. That's in many cases mathematical. But that's a path that we in everyday life don't do, because we maintain our metaphorical knowledge in order to be communicative and to be participant in social life. Okay. 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 Remember this. You remember this image? What we discussed or presented in the framework of the collective symbolic coping process was more or less the collective level. The collective level of what was going on in producing a social response to a new technology. But of course, this is not the only thing that plays a role, because psychology comes in, and we must look at the individuals, how they psychologically cope with the things, with the new stuff. And there we come to the image of monstrosity that's associated with genetic engineering. The left one is genetically modified in our imagination. The other one is a natural mouse. Or more fantastically, in these images that pop up as representing monsters. What is written here is, and tomorrow they want to clone me. It's written this. So there are a number of many fantastical images that connect our way of thinking historically to the deep past. In the deep past, monsters played a big role. And this deep past still informs our thinking nowadays because it's a very basic way of thinking of the human mind, thinking about basically potentially threatening or potentially immoral issues. So what we need to look at, besides the collective process, is also to look at the psychological mechanisms. And this is a characteristic of social representation theory, which is, of course, a social psychological approach, meaning that it tries to bridge the big hiatus that exists between collective approaches and individual psychological approaches. So social representation theory tries to capture or to build a bridge and to connect the two realms that are usually treated in different scientific departments, like sociology, political science, and psychology on the other side. So in order to look at the psychological mechanisms, we were forced to think about what is a moral concern besides hubris, no? What does the term unnaturalness mean when the people say a tomato that is genetically modified is unnatural? I'm sorry, but you will not be able to read anything from your manuscript if you write over it too much. Don't want to interrupt your drawings, but it's okay. But take care not to destroy your manuscript. What is the psychology of monstrosity? What does it have to do with animistic thinking that is still very widespread in modern people? So in order to discuss this, we use the theory that is called psychological essentialism, and that I will briefly explain. So that's a car, a toy car, okay? That's a toy plane, and both are artifacts. They're not natural objects, they're artifacts. And they both have functions. And actually, if you want, you can convert one to the other. If you know how to handle metal or plastic or wood, then you can construct out of the material of a car, you can construct a more or less flying toy plane. But imagine monstrosity is something different. Living beings are something different, and it's not possible to combine one with the other. This is prohibited by our everyday feelings. We have a strong feeling that it's not possible to combine one animal with the next. Okay? And when we see depictions of this, then we feel something like a disgust. No, it's actually a disgusting picture. And this brings us to the essential theory of hybrids and monsters. Whereas artifacts have functions and are being used for something, are constructed for something, that's why they are artifacts. Living kinds or living beings have an essence that makes them a living being. So in a way, our everyday thinking, even small children have an idea of essence when, for example, they say or think that children have been tested about their thinking about adoption. And the way they think about it is, very small children, actually 3, 4, 5 years old, was that, okay, when a child is being adopted from one family to another, then the child, when it grows up, it will still speak the language of the first family. So language being something inscribed or fixed in a living essence that defines the whereabouts and the capacities of the child being adopted. So children, this is a clear example of essentialist thinking. So in a way, essence is an invisible substance in our imagination. Nowadays, this is called very often genetic genome or chromosomes, because we know what genetic inheritance is. But 100 years ago, people didn't know about genetic apparatus, and that's why they talked very often about the blood. It's in the blood how somebody will behave or how somebody is defined. For the fact that a cat is a cat is a cat is responsible, in our knowledge, the genetic apparatus. For 100 or 200 years ago, people thought it's in the blood of the cats to be a cat and a cat and a cat. And meaning that you cannot convert a cat to a dog or a snake to a bird. And here we developed something that's called essentialist theory, the hybrid perception. So we start off with natural kinds, natural beings, and postulate that according to everyday thinking, organisms in our imagination possess something that determines category membership, that determines that a cat is a cat and a dog is a dog, that determines that humans are humans. And this essence or substance is relatively stable. It is inherent to its carrier, and it causally determines the features of our phenotype. Of course, the essence that we possess determines our human appearance. It is immutable and it is discrete. Okay? And in former times, as I said, it was addressed as blood or genes, etc., etc. But the problem is, if we think about immutable, unmixable essences, how shall we imagine the mixing of genes? If genes are the information that makes an animal, and other genes, another genome makes another animal, how is it possible to mix these two essences? What happens when you mix these two essences to make a hybrid, a genetic hybrid out of it? So in our everyday imagination, in interviews with people, the people responded in a way that let us think of as if the people thought that a hybrid will result in being a monster. And this reminded us of our cultural monster theory by an author called Cohen. And he defined several characteristics of monsters, of culturally defined monsters that apply very, very well to our problem. For example, monsters usually straddle the boundary between natural categories. So they are neither this category nor the other one, but they straddle in between. They lose their inference potential. Once I see a monster in my imagination, I don't know how this thing will react. Is it, for example, if I imagine a monster constructed out of a dog and a cat, I don't know, will it bark or will it make meow? So my inference potential, the inference potential of this hybrid is very low. I don't know how to react to it. And of course, it's unfamiliar. It is in general perceived as unpleasant. It's perceived as rejecting, as unnatural, as ugly, etc., etc. And this, as I said, conforms very well to the cultural theory of monstrosity. So whenever we imagine that genes of two living beings are being mixed, in the background of our everyday thinking is the idea of mixing essences. And mixing essences, because they are not mixable, makes the new hybrid collapse, so to say. It has no essence, it has no identity, it is something completely artificial. Will not have a life of its own, will not have a definition of its own. It will not be that or nor that. It will not be flesh nor fish. Okay, meaning that a living being with a collapsed essence is perceived as unnatural and lacking category membership and category identity. And it is perceived as a result of category confusion. That's also a characteristic that cultural theory of monsters describes as being very characteristic of monstrosity. Okay? So, now we have made experiments about how people perceive natural animals and the resulting genetic hybrids. So they were told, imagine, for example, a cow that receives genetic information, or in the ovum of a cow, we introduce the genetic information of a goat. How would you imagine this hybrid coming out of this to be? Would it be ugly or beautiful? Would it be natural, unnatural, etc., etc.? So we had a series of adjectives that we tested. And the natural animals were all categorized relatively positively. The higher up, the more positive is the judgment. Only the mixed animal is being judged as monstrous, as ugly, as unnatural, as rejectable, as dangerous, etc., etc. Meaning that in contrast to natural animals, the hybrids receive a particular characteristic in the perception of our subjects. So more positive is up and more monstrous is down. So we did this series of studies. And we thought actually this kind of thinking about monstrosity may be culturally defined or predicated on our Western cultural history. This would imply that other cultures that are sufficiently different from our Western culture should not share in our way of seeing hybrids as monstrous. So, of course, in order to look at this problem, if it is cross-culturally, if it is a phenomenon that can be seen cross-culturally, or if it's specific for our Western culture, we started off with doing an experiment in Japan. And we did the same experiment in Japan and in Austria, and then looked at the results. And the funny thing is, the results were so similar that the colleague doing the experiment in Japan immediately jumped into an airplane, came to Linz, and we discussed the results because it was so surprising. And it was exactly this, actually. In Austria, we compared humans, natural chimpanzees, and some domestic animal, like a cow or a horse or a dog or something, and had a an experimental design where we combined every possible combination of the two. So we had actually the mix of an animal with a human genome. We had the mixing of human genome into an animal, a human gene into an animal genome. That's the red ones. And the yellow ones are the ones where a gene is taken from one species and implanted into the genome of another member of the same species. So taking a human gene out and planting it in a different human ovum, for example. Okay? That's the yellow points. So you see the manipulation itself of genetic engineering, of genetic interfering with the genetic information, already creates a monstrosity effect. The blue side, the right side of this scale here, is more or less the normal pole of judgment. So chimps, humans, and domestic animals are judged as normal. Applying the operation of genetic interference already makes these results a little bit more monstrous, little bit stranger, a little bit more repellent. But the biggest repellent effect we can see when a human receives an animal gene. That's the most monstrous possible. And the funny thing was, in Japan, it was exactly the same. So the pattern is completely identical. So what we see here is that this monstrosity effect, the way of thinking in terms of essence, is relatively stable across cultures. And in fact, we even replicated this finding also in India, which still is a third culture, which is very different. So what we established by this is that the way of thinking in terms of essence, essentializing living beings, and the consequences of thinking in essences are very similar in different cultures, meaning that it seems to be a basic way of thinking of the human cognitive apparatus, and which gives us some clue of why people are so resistant or don't like genetic engineering, because it interferes, it destroys their idea of a stable environment that is defined by the essences that the living beings possess, by the characteristics of the other natural kinds that exist, for example, etc., etc. So it is endangering the stability of our environment. Just to illustrate some other findings, because we are in a seminar, we are going a little bit more into detail. Here we had an experiment where we exchanged genes within species. That was in the earlier, that was here the yellow manipulation, okay? We had a condition where the genes were exchanged across species. And here are the scales or the results for the genetic parent, that is the natural animal. In these conditions should, of course, be similar or equal. And it is not significant, this difference here. Only the genetic hybrid is different, the judgment about it. If you have, this scale is monstrosity. The higher up, the more monstrous the judgment or the resulting animal. The lower, the more natural or normal is the animal judged. So what we see here, the biggest fear is when you exchange genes across species. Okay, but then we thought there are genetic hybrids in our everyday life. That's the mule, the combination of donkey and horse. And we also have other naturally occurring animals that are genetic mixtures, even though they are not, they cannot procreate, of course. A mule cannot procreate, so it must be created anew every time. So we thought, okay, we have familiar genetic hybrids. That's a mule, for example. And another one would be the Zors, which is a combination of zebra and horse. But even this one is cannot procreate by itself. And thought, could it be that familiarity and unfamiliarity is the key to, to understanding the responses of the people? And here we see that even though it exists, few people have heard about Zorsis, that is the combination of horses and zebra. So it's an unfamiliar kind of hybrid that exists in reality, whereas we have a familiar hybrid also that is the mule, that everybody knows more or less. And if this familiar or unfamiliar is produced by sexual procreation, it is perceived as, let's say, by normal processes, it is perceived as significantly less monstrous, more normal, than when it is produced by manipulations that are like the genetic engineering process. So it is the process of transferring, artificially transferring genes from one species to the other, from across species primarily, that creates the impression of a monstrous result, that the hybrid is not very pleasant to look at. With other data, we did some path analysis, and what we see here is that the judgment of monstrosity has a high relationship with ideas of a violated essence, that in combining genetic information violates the essence of the two animals involved. This goes with 0.38 as a predictor into monstrosity, as well as a factor that is more or less frightened, the way or the degree of being frightening of the operation and of the technical manipulation. But also, we have a path into the fear or the idea that the order, the natural order, is going to be lost from here and here. That is, there is also involved somehow in this kind of technology the fear that the natural order as we know it, our world as we know it with all the categories, will somehow be destroyed. And we will be facing a completely new or different world in which we are going to live. Okay, we all thought this is a relatively artificial experiments. Let's have a look at a stronger data for validating the results. And what we did was that we used a barometer in 2010 where we introduced an item asking about a new technology. The new technology actually is called cisgenics and transgenics. Transgenics is what we know from genetic engineering traditionally, taking a gene from one species and planting into another species. And cisgenics meaning that within a family of living beings, for example, within the family of apples, there are many different species of apples, but within this family of apples, we take a gene and plant it into another species of apple. But they are in the same family, okay? You wanted to say something? No, that's okay. So this would be cisgenics. This would be transgenics, taking, for example, genetic information from a microbe, from bacteria, and planting it into apples. So these two technologies really exist. And we tested this in a Eurobarometer, and the results are here. Judging riskiness. We see that the green one is cisgenic apples, so the less, well, let's say the less obtrusive manipulation of the genome is always very more positive. It's safer, it's not harmful, not so harmful for the environment, it's less unnatural, and it deserves more support across the European populations, which is about 30,000 people. The transgenic apples are the red ones. You can see there is significant difference in this riskiness and it being harmful for the environment and in deserving support and being unnatural. This more or less confirms what we have postulated by psychological experiments before. So in a way, we are looking at a non-consequentialist appraisal, which means in the school of risk psychology, of decision theory and riskiness theory, it means that people don't judge the riskiness of something by assessing the real risks involved, as a risk scientist would want it to be, because we're also rational. No, the general public is much more irrational in using other non-consequentialist criteria in order to judge something as being negative. For example, the expected monstrosity of a genetic hybrid, which for risk theorists is, of course, not very nice because it doesn't follow the models that were developed actually in connection with nuclear energy. Nuclear power plants, as you know, are sometimes when they run havoc, they are getting dangerous, like 3 years ago in Japan, earlier in Chernobyl, and even earlier in Great Britain, and 3 Mile Island in the US. So we have a good share of risky power plants, nuclear power plants in the world. And the assessed risk of those very well, even in public understanding, in public way of thinking about the risks, fulfills very well the models of risk theorists. But with genetic engineering, the models of the risk theories collapse. They don't work, simply because of the processes that we try to show here. So let's summarize. What is a natural kind? Natural kinds are things that we attribute with some uniqueness. No? We think in qualities, not in quantities, about stones, about trees, about our pets at home. Whereas science, as Quine, this philosopher of science in a paper 1969, has shown that scientific progress actually is making the qualitative judgments quantitative. And the fact that science is able to do genetic engineering is an illustration of this making a quality quantitative, because it's possible to take in a quantitative way genetic information, which is a quantitative term, from one genome and implant it into another one. So this is a result of making nature quantifiable, which stands in stark contrast to everyday thinking, which is very much concentrated on qualia, as it is called in philosophy, or on qualities of the things. And an essence of a living being is also a quality of this living being that makes it unique, that cannot be cut into half. If you cut an essence into half, it disappears, it collapses. So, in conclusion, psychological processes drive social processes. That is the collective symbolic coping theory that we presented. And both are required to construct an image of social representations, to look at the functioning, at the form, and how they are attained on the collective level of a social representation. So social representations are something actually quite useful for analyzing or looking at societal events, societal issues, because it gives us some approach, some way of thinking about how to bridge these different sides of the human existence. That's the individual experience and the level of the collective, of us all together in a society. Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Yeah.
I mean, it's more for the first part of the theory. I was wondering how much you actually have these totally unfamiliar things to introduce into the society, how much actually sort of, I mean, the society or people will sort of try to sort of link them to the familiar, the pre-existing metaphors and stuff. For example, I mean, the same thing with breeding, I mean, which has been going on for centuries. And
the natural breeding, you mean, Now, funny enough, this breeding argument is brought up by the industry when they want to suppress the resistance of the public. They say, genetic engineering is nothing else than natural breeding. We have done this for thousands of years. But they don't see the difference, or they don't want to communicate the difference between genetic engineering and breeding. What is the difference? The difference is that genetic engineering can produce in hours or days results that in natural breeding took years or even decades or centuries. And in these decades and centuries where natural breeding was produced new, more docile cows, for example, not as wild as the original cow species, the wild one. In these centuries where this breeding occurred, any negative functions would have been discovered, and so to say, Mendeled out. Mendel is the person who did in the 19th century these genetic experiments with peas, pea plants, looking at the inheritance of colors of the flowers of pea. Okay, everybody understands pea plants? Okay, the little green things that we eat. Would have been, we say Mendel out if we want to say that something is being discovered as being harmful, and so we leave it aside. So if you have centuries to look at breeding and the results of breeding, you have time enough to take away the breeding line that was not producing good results. But if you do this in days, or maybe weeks, in a laboratory, you have no time to see any negative development. And the people, the general public, feels this lie. It is a lie from the industry, I must say, because it is incomparable, the two processes. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, to go further than how this GMO debate can actually sort of reframe, for example, the debate that came later, the one when genetic engineering actually is already on the human.
Okay.
I mean, like, Andre has also done some studies that, that this process in the places where GMO debate took place were a bit different than, from, for example, in Estonia, where the gene bank came.
You had very little discussion about this.
Where the
Yeah.
GMO debate hadn't been existing, and
Yeah.
how there was this chance of sort of reframing it different, and then actually it happened in Western Europe, where there's this discussion has already been.
Yeah, politicians very often have an interest to subdue, not to get let the discussion develop, particularly on these things. And the same happened in Iceland, where they wanted to create this unique study to assess genetically all of the Iceland's population, and to see, because Iceland is a society with very little mixing from the outside. It's always very much endogamic. So you can really follow the lines, the genetic lines of illnesses, of genetic illnesses. You can follow the lines of certain phenotypic attributes. And they wanted to do a across the table genetic assessment of the Icelandic people, which scientifically is completely interesting. But on the other hand, once you have this in a data bank, who is going to use that, for what reasons, and with what goals, was at the end discussed, and this public discussion in Iceland stopped this project, even though scientifically it's extremely interesting. So you, as far as I understood, here, sorry?
In Iceland, they reconvened.
The reconvene, yeah. Okay, good. That you know more than I have. Very, very interesting. And what about here? You have said that here you are creating something like a genetic data bank?
It was like in the early 2000s, and when the aim was the same, to have 1 million samples.
Yeah. Well, 1 million is all of Estonia.
I think
No?
they stopped at 50,000 actually. So
Okay.
because they didn't get well, but I mean the process was different because in Iceland it was opt out. I mean people, you know.
Yeah, of course.
But here it was opt in, and
The Estonian population also is very pure, if you want to say that. Even though,
heterogeneous. I mean, this was the argument that they had.
yes, but still much less mixed than, for example, Central European people, where we had migration routes from all directions. But still not as pure, of course, as Iceland, where we have an island that is being difficult to access from the outside. But obviously there is not a strong debate going on here about this, is there? No? Well, if it's interesting,
I mean, it's more complicated.
yeah, let us know.
But
3
because
sentences.
The promises, I mean, the promise actually on which this recruitment was built, that everybody will get their gene card, you know, with the whole of genetic data.
Yeah.
But because, you know, it's,
It was started very optimistically, but it went.
But why did it go?
I mean, first it was a private venture, and then it ran out of money, and then now it's the public venture. And now they have more scientific goals, less commercial goals. But they still have, I mean, there is still a project going on, which is hoping to get some government funding to actually do the gene chip, which would include like 1 million, not all, but 1 million.
People.
Not people, but the
Samples.
not samples, but the genetic markers. Like
Okay.
All of the genome, but you know the ones which are not really.
Right.
But I mean, there is an inside debate within the genetic community about you know what will happen when you actually have the card.
Yeah.
Who will pay for the consequences of this one?
And who will profit of it?
But it's not so much on the public.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.